From Park Thrillers blog, I'm Sean Smith, and this is National Park Talk. So this is an Ask Me Anything episode of National Park Thrillers. This is an opportunity for my readers and fans and listeners to ask me anything about my writing, my love of national parks, those sorts of things. So from time to time I get questions, and this is an opportunity to compile some of the best ones and answer those. If I don't get to your question today, shoot me a note at Sean Writes, that's SeanWrites @yahoo.com, and maybe I'll answer your question in the future. So let's get to it. One of the first questions, or one of the most often questions I get is, how did you get into writing thrillers? And why do you write thrillers? So it's a great question. When I was younger, if you'd asked me I was going to write thrillers when I grew up, I would have said no way. I didn't consider myself the best writer. In fact, my grade school teachers would be shocked to know that I'm actually writing books now. If you saw all the red marks that were all over my assignments, there's no way you would have predicted that I'd have written thrillers in the future. In fact, I didn't consider myself a very good writer and put it off for a very long time. But a funny thing happened as I grew up. I read a lot of thrillers, and some of my favorites are Tom Clancy and Dan Brown and others. But I always was left with the idea or the feeling that there could be better stories or more intriguing stories. I actually was a park ranger, some of you know, in Yellowstone National Park. And I really loved James Bond movies growing up. In fact, my dad named me after Sean Connery. And I was at a theater in Jackson Hole watching one. And as I was watching it, I was struck by how many of the things James Bond was doing I had done as a National Park Ranger. I had rappelled off cliffs. I had shot guns. I'd driven cars, fast cars, and I'd even flown airplanes. Just about everything James had done, short of chasing terrorists, I had done as a National Park Ranger. And it occurred to me, a park ranger would make a great protagonist for a thriller series. And then I got to thinking about the James Bond series and how much I love it. And I've been fortunate to go to many of the places that James has been to, but it occurred to me that many Americans had probably never been to those places. And so wouldn't it be cool to have a James Bond type hero set in places that Americans had actually been to, like their national parks? And that's kind of how the idea was born. I got my first idea for a story at Yellowstone, and I'm going to talk about this a little later, but it occurred to me that Yellowstone is an outstanding national park, but it also presents an unprecedented threat to not only the United States, but to humanity. If the volcano at Yellowstone were to erupt, there would be little that humanity could do to manage, stop, protect itself from a catastrophic eruption. So I thought, it would make a great place for a story, great place for a setting. And since I had worked at Yellowstone and had an intimate kind of behind the scenes knowledge of some of the places at Yellowstone, that made the appeal of the story even greater. So I really thought it would make a great book, and that turned into my first thriller called Unleashing Coulter's Hell. So one of the questions I get quite often is, what are my motivations? What inspires me, or what is the source of my stories? And I think it's a great question. I think all good authors at some point have to be in touch with their inner self in order to figure out what best moves them, what best pulls on their emotions, in order to then create good stories. And maybe I wasn't aware of it at first, but I slowly realized what it was that really makes for powerful stories, what really connects with me. And it's those things that touch an inner part of you, a section of perhaps your deepest fears. And that's what motivates my writing and my thrillers. I look for those things that really keep me up at night. And I know things like the horror genre, for some people, that's scary, things that go bump in the night. But that doesn't really connect with me. So I've written my first 3 novels on things that keep me up or concern me. First of which, as I mentioned earlier, was Unleashing Coulter's Hell. It's about a volcanic eruption in Yellowstone National Park, but not just any volcanic eruption, what's called an eruption that's called an extinction event. Every so often things happen on this planet Earth that threaten life as we know it across the globe. And Yellowstone is a volcano that has the ability to significantly alter our way of life and even threaten our existence here on this planet. Scientists tell us that Yellowstone has had catastrophic eruptions in the past. In fact, there's geologic evidence that stretches all the way into what is present-day Idaho that shows volcanic eruptions about every 600,000 years. So 2.1 million years ago, about 1.5 million, 600,000 years ago. And they also tell us that Yellowstone's on about a 600,000 year cycle. And unfortunately, the last eruption was 600,000 years ago. So Yellowstone's due. But I don't want people losing sleep over that. The fact of the matter is that estimate could be plus or minus 100,000 years. So it's unlikely that it'll happen anytime in our lifetimes. But eventually the volcano will erupt again. And if it happens within the next, say, 1,000 years, humanity may be hard-pressed to survive that. But in my story, Unleashing Coulter's Hell, I took that idea and then said, well, could someone make that volcano erupt? What if someone was able to get an atomic bomb into the park and trigger a catastrophic eruption? What would that mean for the country? And how would a park ranger actually stop that? And so that's what motivated my first story. The second one, called Lost Cause, which is also out and available on Amazon, is about another thing that keeps me up at night, and that's rebellion. Here in the United States, we've been fortunate to have a fairly stable government. We had one civil war. That was 150 years ago. And for representative democracies, that's pretty atypical. It's pretty unprecedented to have a stable government for 150 years. The United States is unique and lucky to have such a stable government that allows for the peaceful transfer of powers between presidents and Congress and courts. That isn't always the case in other countries. And so I think sometimes we forget how fortunate we are here in the United States and that there are people out there actively working to bring on rebellion, to bring on a civil war. And my second book is about that idea, that there's a subculture of people that are actively working or believe the wrong side won in the Civil War, and that they will do everything in their power to foster a second Civil War, or as they call it, the continuation of the first Civil War. It's an interesting call or an interesting bumper sticker that you see in some places in the South that the Civil War isn't over. It's actually just halftime. And so that second story is about an effort to find a relic that supposedly has the power to whoever finds it can start a second Civil War. And again, the protagonist in my book, Grayson Cole, is at the center of that because this look or this search for that relic takes place in what are many modern day national parks. Many of the national park sites were adopted or transferred from the Department of the Military, the Department of Defense, and made national parks. And those include some of our most famous national battlefields like Gettysburg, Antietam, some of our forts like Fort Monroe and others. And that's where my second book takes place. My third book focuses on another idea that tends to keep me up at night, which is invasion. The United States has been a fairly stable country, and we've been fairly unique and blessed again to seldom have foreign powers on our shore. But that doesn't mean invasion won't come in the future. It was a huge fear during World War II that the Japanese were capable and planning to invade the west coast of the United States. And I believe that Hitler had plans that if he was able to conquer England, his plan eventually was to invade the United States. So it's something that's out there, and my third book explores that idea. What would happen if the United States were invaded? And the story takes place at Mount Rainier, where the world's first sighting of an unidentified flying object took place. The story centers on the possibility that something is up on the mountain and that there are people actively working to reveal it, but also to keep it covered up, and that there's a search to find that. And once again, the protagonist is at Grayson Cole's at the center of that. I have a fourth book that I'm thinking about, and another idea that maybe doesn't keep me up at night, but produces as much emotion or pisses me off as much as the other ones, is corruption. How is our government corrupted, and who benefits from that corruption, and how does that impact the management of our parks and special places? And the fourth book that I'm thinking about, which I believe I'm going to call With Friends Like These, it's going to center on that type of idea, that there are people out there that financially benefit from the national parks, and that they would do anything to keep that funding going. And so that's the idea behind the fourth book. I also get questions about what are some upcoming episodes of National Park Talk? What are you going to look at? And if you have ideas, shoot me an email on things you'd like me to talk about. I'd be happy to look into those. That's what this Ask Me Anything's about. Again, if you want to get in touch with me, my email is seanwrites@yahoo.com. That's SEANWRITES @yahoo.com. But I've got some ideas for a couple upcoming episodes. One will be on the anniversary of the Apollo program, possibility of the United States establishing national monuments on the moon, turning the Apollo lander sites into sites, units of the national park system. And that's a possibility that could take place. There's already been legislation introduced to do just that, but President Obama actually has the authority to designate them as monuments right now. And we're going to talk about that in July. Along with monuments on the moon, I want to talk about the establishment of national monuments in general in another episode. There's a lot of confusion out there among the public about what's the difference between national parks and national monuments, or even national forests. And there are designation differences, and there's ways those different units get created. And we're going to talk about those and where they end up and who has the authority to manage those, and maybe some of the politics behind that. And then finally, this summer, we're going to go out in the field and actually visit Yellowstone National Park during the National Park Service's 100th anniversary celebration. So I hope to do a remote show from out in the park as well. So look for those in the upcoming months. Another question I get quite often is, where can I buy your books? All right, I'm kidding. Actually, I don't get that question that often, or as often as I would hope that I would get it. But for those that are interested, you can pick up my books on Amazon. If you search for Unleashing Coulter's Hell or Lost Cause, they will come up. But I also have a website, bit.ly/Park Thrillers. That's bit.ly/Park Thrillers. You can find my books there too. That link will take you straight to my Amazon page, and you can download them there. I really enjoy writing thrillers. I often tell the joke that writing books is easy. Selling books is hard. It's amazing how much work goes into marketing, promoting, finding customers, trying to find ways to always put your books in front of people. You don't want to be obnoxious about it, but you always have to be thinking creatively about how to connect your books to whatever may be happening that day. So, for example, one of the biggest promotions I've done, or one of the things that created the most interest, was a mashup I did between the national parks and Star Wars. I created national park posters set on Star Wars planets. So on Tatooine, Hoth, and others, I would promote or create a poster of what a national park on those planets would be. And that promotion got me thousands of hits. I just wish it turned into thousands of book sales as well. But it's always interesting to think of ways to create or tie my love of national parks to whatever's happening in the popular culture, but also how to tie thrillers to what's happening in the popular culture. And people have asked me, well, how do you promote your books? It's mostly word of mouth. It's a lot of social media. I've bought a few paid ads, but those didn't turn out as well as I would hope. So most of it's free media. I'm always, as I said, looking for ways to tie my books to something that's happening in the popular culture. I'm always commenting on things related to national parks. I've created a blog where I consistently and regularly write about national parks. But I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account. And it's just a matter of constantly, for lack of a better word, pushing your books so that people remember that you're out here. In the future, I plan on doing some free giveaways. I've heard that that is one way to get readership. Give away one of your books and then have enough of a selection of other books that people will hopefully buy those if they like your first one. So look for that in the future. Thank you for listening. National Park Talk is produced and recorded in Western Washington in the shadow of Mount Rainier. To learn more about National Park Talk, please visit our website at seandavidSmith.blogspot.com or follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/parkthrillers. To find us on Twitter, search for @parkthrillers. I'm Sean Smith. Thanks again for listening to National Park Talk.